Hey, haircut, what's up? I look terrible, and oh gosh, baby face here. And today I'm gonna do an album review, another classic album review before this month ends, before summer ends, and it's going to be Godspeed You, Black Emperor with Lift Your Skinny Fists Like Antennas to Heaven. And yeah, this is one of the most critically acclaimed album of all time. Also, one of my favorite albums of all time, admittedly. I know it's cliche, but this album, come on. It's a great album. It's a classic, and everybody who loves music knows that. So Godspeed You, Black Emperor is a band, a post-rock band from Canada who makes gigantic post-rock tracks that are super cinematic with different instrumentals, different samples and drones and textures. But in terms of post-rock, they are actually very different from their contemporaries like Mogwai or Explosions in the Sky or Sigiros or Mono, because they're usually very sunny, bright, warm, full of life and full of heart, and sometimes they're really relaxing and very beautiful, and sometimes they're intensely optimistic, and it sounds like, you know, rising up into the sky through the layer of clouds and looking at the sun directly in its face. But Godspeed You, Black Emperor is a way more different band than that. The band that I think sounds the closest to Godspeed is Swans, the noise rock band, and not their earlier abrasive, noisy albums, but their later, more ethereal, more cinematic, and more melodic stuffs, with more textures and drones and noise. And this album here, it's essentially a 90-minute long album. It has 4 tracks, and each track is about 20 minutes long. We have Storm, Static, Sleep, and Antennas to Heaven. But all of these tracks have different movements. There are many different sections of ambient and noise, and sometimes sound collage, samples, field recordings, and different instrumentals. And usually these instrumentals would rise to a very climactic tip-top, and sometimes plunge into a very deep, dark, and depressing low. And this is not actually their first album. They actually had an EP and also a debut album called F-sharp, A-sharp, Infinity, which has 3 tracks, but each one of them are very long-winded, and they're all actually pretty solid, similar to the tracks on this album, except I guess not as refined. But what I love about F-sharp, A-sharp, Infinity is that it has a constant urge and a constant tension underneath, and it always builds to such a beautiful and explosive climax. I really love the first track, the Dead Flag Blues, which has a very gritty and dark opening with the spoken word, and then later on we get some incredibly sad and downtrodden guitars, as well as some really dejected guitars layered on top of one another to make one of the saddest Godspeed track, if not the saddest. And I also really love Providence. I think it's one of the more criminally underrated tracks of Godspeed. I really love the very primal drums with this really great texture to it at the 7-minute mark. I always jump to that mark alone just to listen to that drum section whenever I have free time and I want to feel like I'm off to explore the world. And after Lift Your Skinny Fists, they also released an album called Yankee XO in the year 2002. And even though it's not as good as its 2 predecessors, it still has some great tracks like Rockets Fall on Rocket Falls, which is a bit of an orchestral rock monster giant. But my favorite is, of course, Motherfucker Equals to Redeemer, because it is actually one of the most intense and rapid but yet danceable songs on Godspeed's discography. I don't know why am I not pronouncing words clearly today. Anyway, let's jump back to this album. This is their most influential, most impactful, and most critically acclaimed album to date. But the reason why I think this album is their most critically acclaimed is that this album is the most vast, the most ambitious, the most creative, the most colorful, the most rich in sounds and textures, also the most versatile. There are tons of ambient and noise and also field recordings and found sounds. And the instrumentals here, while sometimes it's very urgent and aggressive and even a little punk-edged, but also it has a classical vibe to it, and not the symphonic classical. More like the fact that there are a lot of orchestral instrumentations in the album, and they're all coming together, layering on top of one another to create one beautiful, explosive harmony. And also a lot of the tracks here, actually, there are moments on this album that feel kinda socio-politically charged, even though none of the band members here actually sing. And fun fact, because after Godspeed You Black Emperor disbanded after Yankee XO, another band with similar members are formed called the Silver Mount Zion Orchestra or something. They change their name all the time, but in that band, they sing. But anyway, let's get into this album. We have the album opening, Storm. Also, there is a map of all the movements in this album. But anyway, I'm going to go through all the movements. We have the title movement, the first 6 minutes of the album, and it's one of the most beautiful 6 minutes in musical history ever. These opening 6 minutes sound like a very sweet and warm farewell to a life that you really treasured and cherished in the past. And that's what I really love about the opening of the album, because the opening sounds like it's near death, but the ending to the album sounds like it's about to be alive. But at the same time, it sounds like the other way around, because what this title movement also sounds like is giving birth to a child, or more like being born as a child, as an infant, having a beginning, a starting point to life. And also these 6 minutes sound like all is well. Life is well, and it's satisfying, and you know it deep inside your soul, and that's why you're truly happy from the surface to the core. But yeah, anyway, instrumentally, it's breathtaking. We get all these beautiful pianos and strings and guitars and these marching drums, and they all escalate to an extremely beautiful and life-affirming, eye-widening, and soul-opening climax. And afterwards, it quiets down and it builds up once again, except this time the guitar leads are a little different, and the drums, they are a little more drawn out, and you can really hear the track evolve. And then again, it hits a very dramatic and beautiful climax. And usually when when the band hits a climax, they will not just immediately die down. They would either ascend to another level of brightness or descend into a level of darkness. And sometimes there are key changes as well, which are really amazing. At the 12-minute mark of the track Storm, there's this very And at the 12-minute mark of this album, there's this really urgent and intense marching drums that's reintroduced into the track, and it's extremely beautiful. And it gets more and more and more intense and loud and noisy, and then it stops. It chomps. And then we get a series of very vast, empty, and drony ambient passages and sound collages and samples. At first, we get the Barco AM/PM supermarket, which I think is a supermarket near the south, the southwest of USA, or maybe Mexico, because of the Mexican Spanish, or maybe in Spain, who knows. But anyway, it's not a very clear sample. The band has to make it muddier, choppier, and a little more broken to make it feel alienated and perhaps kind of damaged and corrupted. And then after that, we get Cancer Towers on Holy Road Highway, which has these really dark piano strikes and these very static, dusty, and kind of disturbing and unsettling voices in walkies. And then after that, we transition into Static, which starts off with Terrible Canyons of Static, which is I think my favorite ambient passage in the entire album, where we just get this extremely vast, empty, eerie, and haunting ambient space where you're in this plane, in this zone that reaches beyond infinity. And we also get these train chugging sounds, I think, and I think train horns that are just compressed and distorted in a way it's barely recognizable, but they all come together to make this very cold and very eerie environment that's just very beautiful, in my opinion. Then we transition into Atomic Clock, which has these very intimate and loud and ear-piercing bleeps, except these bleeps are very rapid, they're very fast, they're uncontrollable, and they're just really there, like noise in the background. The real core part of the song really starts at chart number 3, where we hear a woman priest, a priestess, sort of giving a sermon about how after you die, you see God. And she's really passionate and excited about what she's saying. But the way her voice is pitched, it's lower pitched, and with these incredibly dark and tragic weeping guitars underneath, it really makes for one of the most chilling and disturbing moments on the entire album. And then these weepy strings sort of rise up, and we go into one of my favorite moments in the entire album, in the track World Police and Friendly Fire, where we are introduced to this incredibly just painful wailing guitars just piercing into the wall of strings, and then these incredibly dark and gloomy, tiptoey guitars sort of repeatedly being played underneath. It just gives me goosebumps. This moment gives me goosebumps. And also, if you look at the title of the track, it says World Police and Friendly Fire. World Police, USA, Friendly Fire, shootings. At least that's my hypothesis. But with that in mind, when I listen to the track, it becomes even more soul-crushing and honestly mortifying. And it just escalates and rises to an incredibly dark climactic point. It just spirals upwards towards insanity. It becomes demented at some point. And then at the 13-minute mark, it sort of quiets down, and these marching drums is sort of introduced, and it becomes very slithery. This track sounds like all the victims of mass shootings in the world, and their souls sort of scream in pain every time someone also dies because of the same reason and joining them. It's really painful to listen through the whole thing. Anyway, afterwards, we get the buildings. They're sleeping now. I really love the title of movements and tracks and albums from Godspeed, You Black Emperor, because they would use, instead of using minimalism, which is a style of art that a lot of the artists nowadays use, they would go for anti-minimalism. They would use a lot of words that don't go together really well to convey maybe some sort of abstract meaning that sort of give a very subtle, almost Catholic vibe to it. Like, I can just make up a Godspeed You Black Emperor title right now, like, hurrah, exclamation mark, the birds will sing our names, or the sun and Jupiter shines two beams of light upon my chest, or something. Like, usually that's how it goes. But anyway, the last few minutes of the track Static is very noisy but very empty at the same time. And then we transition into disc 2 with one of the most famous Godspeed tracks, Sleep, where at first we get an interview with Murray Austral, a New Yorker who talks about Coney Island, about how the people there don't sleep on the beaches anymore. And then we start to get these very depressing and dejected guitars in the back. That sounds like it's nostalgic but also painful at the same time. Like, the past is so beautiful and full of life, and now in the present day it's just so dark and it's so bitter nowadays. And then we transition into Monheim, and it has these incredibly forlorn and sad strings that are sort of vibrating very intensely. It sounds like an animal with a very destructive disease, with a very heavy disease, and the animal is crying for help. It's incredibly dark, and again it just gets more and more tense and urgent with these rapid drums and guitars. And then we get into Broken Windows, the second half of the track, where it suddenly changes its keys into something incredibly heavenly, as if our lives have purpose now. But yeah, anyway, Sleep is still one of the most breathtaking tracks ever. It really takes your breath. Actually, all of the tracks here on this album, they take your breath, all 4 of them. The 4th track is Like Antennas to Heaven, and it is the final chapter of the album, and it's a little under 20 minutes long. At first we get Maya Sings Baby O, which is another really compressed and unclear and obscured sort of recording, which sounds like the band is preparing us for the final farewell, for the climactic ending. It's sort of like when you're about to die, when you're about to enter the gates of heaven, or whatever it's gonna be. All the memories of your life is gonna flash before your eyes. And it's what it sounds like in the beginning of the track, where it doesn't flash like very quickly. It flashes like in real time. And so we get a snippet of this singing, and we get a snippet of distorted noise, which is incredibly wobbly and swirly. It's called Edgyswingsetacid, and it's not one of the more interesting moments on the album, but it still sounds like a very important step in finally reaching the gates of heaven. Anyway, we get the Glockenspiel duet afterwards, which is, again, an incredibly corrupted and damaged and alienated and compressed recording, which sounds like broken pieces of memory trying its best to glue together to make some sort of sense. And we also get these constant tapping in the back, which makes it sound even more broken and sort of disjointed even. We get Attention / Mon Ami, Fa La 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 La, and it's basically a snippet of singing from these kids in French Canada. And afterwards we get the core part of the track. She dreamt she was a bulldozer. She dreamt she was in an empty field. And it's not scary or dark or terrifying at all. It's actually very much the opposite. It's incredibly lively and explosive. The guitars, they are full of life, and they sort of bring you back to the most touching and powerful moments of love in your life. And then at the 6-minute mark, all that happened in the span of 6 minutes. It just quiets down, and we get these very empty, windy sounds that are very quiet and subtle. And then afterwards, it builds back up again, like the track Storm, where it gets pretty climactic. It's full of life. It makes you see the world in its completion, in its most beautiful state, in its core, and it makes you realize that even though your life means nothing, it still matters, and not because of the world, but because of you, the existence of you. It actually matters. Anyway, afterwards we have Death Camp Drone, which is this really weird, spacey, cloudy, ambient passage. And it sounds like you have finally entered the gates of heaven, and you finally understand the secret of life in the form of some sort of fluid, substance, medium. And then you slowly levitate through that, and you reach the ending of the album, Antennas to Heaven, where we get these pulsating drones and these very distorted sounds, like they're reeds or strings or guitars, but they just scream, and in a very regular way. In a way, it's intentionally regular. And then afterwards, the album ends. And yeah, overall, this album is a hell of an experience. It's incredibly unique and creative and ambitious, and going through the entire album is like going through life in 90 minutes. And the recording is great. The layered instrumentations, the tension building, they're fantastic. The band really knows how to build tension and how to handle epic climaxes and depressing lows and drony ambient noise passages, and the whole thing sort of assembles very beautifully. And there are different interpretations of what this album represents. Some people say it represents life, like the beginning of life and death. But I mean, yeah, that's probably the most plausible explanation. I guess it's more of like life and death in the beginning, and then death and life at the end, and sort of intersecting in between. But I don't know. I'm making too much assumptions here. Making too many assumptions. This is one of my favorite albums of all time, and this is incredibly beautiful. Incredibly eye-widening, soul-opening, heart-enlightening, and there are 4 tracks here, so I can't really say which track is my favorite or least favorite. On some days, Storm is my favorite. On some days, Sleep is my favorite. Most of the days, Static is my favorite. I don't know. I guess I'm gonna say most tracks here are my favorite. And my least favorite is, I don't know. I guess the Edgyswingsetacid movement is a bit of a low moment here. But still, it's not even bad. The whole album, it's fantastic. It's great. And great, all caps. I am giving this album a 10 out of 10, hands down. So, have you listened to this album? From 1 to 10, how much did you rate it? Like if you like it, and subscribe if you want more, and thanks for watching.